Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob, and it's time to fire up another doubleheader with the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Rob, there are only 8 championship points between McLaren and Red Bull, while Ferrari sit just 31 points behind second. So, does anyone have the momentum heading into this weekend?
It's tough to say, isn't it? Because we've had mixed results from all teams in the last few races or so. I don't think the gap is certainly going to widen anytime soon. And yeah, as you pointed out, McLaren have looked good. Ferrari are on the up. Red Bull are, probably going to come around at some point, right? So it's anyone's race heading into Baku.
And no team has won 3 consecutive races this season, which really goes to show you just how exciting 2024 has been so far. For me, I know McLaren are disappointed with the result at Monza, but they're still one of the safest bets on the grid. And I think that'll be a recurring theme as we go through some of my lineup builds later in the show. So on this episode, we're going to experiment with a shorter version of our winners and losers so we can get right into the action at Baku. And also, Rob's going to lead us through some breaking news on the Logan Sargeant situation, so you're not going to want to miss that. As always, if you like what you see, please be sure to like and subscribe so we can bring you bigger and better content in the weeks ahead. So Rob, let's get into this trimmed down version of our winners and losers. I'm going to hit us with a winner, and that's Franco Colapinto making his F1 debut. So our expectations were low for Franco. He finished P12 after starting P18. He had a great weekend on track. It was an 11-point performance in F1 Fantasy. And 11 points is higher than any race for Logan Sargeant this season, just 1 point off of Alex Albon's season high of 12 he set back a few months ago. Colapinto also picked up $0.5 million in value, so I really like what I'm seeing so far from the rookie.
Hasn't he had a great start to his career in Formula One? I think there was a lot of skepticism around the Argentinian heading into his debut race, but Williams have had, some pretty good results there over the years in recent times, and I had an inkling that he'd have a good drive because the Williams upgrades that were rolled out in Zandvoort seemed to work for Albon, and he translated that again in Monza. And Colapinto, starting from P18, had a sensational drive, as you say, all the way up into P12. So a great start to his Formula One career.
And now, Rob, you've got a loser for us. Who was the biggest loser this week?
For me, it was Max Verstappen, and I think you could name any number of drivers on this list as we've got here. But the reason I have Max is just because of the fact the Red Bull struggles have continued week in, week out. And I think it was very much on show most recently in Monza. It's been a track Max has done very well at in the years prior, but to qualify P8, which is well below where he'd typically be, was just clearly not up to scratch for his usual performances. He did obviously make a few drives, a few good strides forward in the race to finish obviously a little higher than usual, but notwithstanding that, it's not been a week to remember for Max Verstappen at Monza, and Ferrari and McLaren seem to have overshadowed Red Bull once again.
They just seemed lost the whole weekend. They're having a hard time understanding the car. We heard it a lot with Sergio Perez with his struggles earlier in the spring. Now we're seeing it with Max. He's outperforming some of those struggles, but still it's not enough to crack into the podium contention. This is now a long stretch of races where we haven't seen Max even on the podium. And meanwhile, it's extending all the way down into Red Bull. They had a couple of really slow pit stops, and so now it's making the constructor harder and harder to justify. And I find Red Bull in this zone that we had Ferrari in previous races where I can't justify running them, and they're going to have to prove their way out of it before I can trust them again.
Yeah, definitely. There's talk that they'll obviously turn it around or hopefully when we get to Circuit of the Americas, once they've made corrections to the car, but it's a long way to go until we get to Austin. And, we've got 2 tracks coming up in Baku and again in Singapore, where I definitely expect Ferrari to continue that trend that we saw in Monza. So I think Red Bull, as has been the case lately, probably not on our shopping list anytime soon.
Agreed. So let's move on now to our 5th Gear Garms contest question for this week. And we have a lot to unpack on this subject. And it's, do you currently own Logan Sargeant? And if so, who is a good replacement for him? I do, coming into this week. And so I'm very interested to see what happens in the coming days with that asset. And Rob, you're going to lead us into discussion on that in just a moment. For me, if gun to my head right now, if I had to get Sargeant out, he's so cheap, I can't bring in someone else. Colapinto, I already have on my team, but if you didn't have him, he's now too expensive to bring in. So I would probably sub out Sargeant and Yuki Tsunoda and bring in Zhou Guanyu and Alex Albon. And I think that's enough of a switch that allows me to keep my triple McLaren build, but I'm not thrilled about it. If you were put in the same spot, Rob, what would you do?
Yeah, I kind of have to agree with you on that. It's obviously a situation many are hamstrung with, and we don't quite know what's next, which we'll get into shortly around Logan Sargeant and Franco Colapinto for Williams. But I think you'd have to look at probably one of the Sauber assets. They're both Colapinto aside, many of which already own him, are probably the next best route in terms of affordability. So I'd probably, as you say, go for a Zhou or a Bottas, and then probably look at again an Alex Albon or a Nico Hülkenberg, depending on what your budget is, if you don't already own those drivers.
So be sure to head over to our fan ant base and answer this question for a chance to win a great prize from our sponsor, Fifth Gear Garms. That's a great segue straight into our hit list and the number one news item for this week, because Rob, you helped break this news that Motorsport confirmed with a source at F1 that they plan to close the loophole on Logan this week. Tell us what we know.
Yeah, we know a lot and still not all that much at all. The news from Motorsport that was released on Monday morning was that F1 have confirmed to Motorsport that they will make a correction to Logan Sargeant's place in the game. A lot of people, as you alluded to, obviously were able to take advantage of that loophole where you could own him without him actually being a driver that featured on the grid week to week at 4.8 million, as we talked about last week. A huge budget enabler to obviously level up other parts of our team, especially those premium drivers like Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc. And I think now we're at a situation where there's been nothing from F1 to confirm as what the next steps are for how they will treat Logan Sargeant and his owners in the game. There's probably a number of different approaches that we could debate as to what direction they may go. But it does mean that a lot of people who do own Logan Sargeant, I believe it's 20% if I'm not mistaken, Adam, will have to address this issue heading into Baku.
I'm so interested to see how exactly they close the loophole, because if you've ever tried saving a lineup with only 4 drivers and they remove Logan from the game, then what happens? Preventing you from saving that team with only 4 drivers is an error proofing that makes them not have to deal with the consequence of what if a driver is removed from 1 in 5 teams in the game. So does it create a new loophole where you can only run 4 drivers? Do they create a new penalty if you create a team that doesn't have Sargeant on it? You only run 4 drivers, that's minus something, minus 15 or minus 20? Or is it a soft closure where you won't be able to save a team with Logan Sargeant, which means no chips, no change to the 2x boosted driver, no change to your drivers and constructors, but if you're willing to roll your team out for a few weeks, they still can't quite close that. So I'm very interested to see what these next few days look like, because it could still give us some outs on this.
Yeah, 100%. I think they're all very logical suggestions, and I think the most obvious ones to Formula One to consider. I think the biggest issue, though, realistically stems from the fact that they could have corrected it before Monza, and with Franco Colapinto entering at the time at 4.8 million, would have been a very easy swap for F1 to make for people who own Sargeant directly into Colapinto. But the fact that Colapinto's obviously had a barnstorming race in Monza, he's gone up 0.5 million. The net zero change obviously doesn't exist anymore. The damage is essentially already done from, I'd call it damage, but anyone who's obviously got that Colapinto increase is going to take that as a positive. I think realistically it puts F1 in quite a bind, which could have very much been resolved, last week. But I suppose at the same time, there hasn't really been a precedent set, or if we could call it a precedent, in the previous instances of Bearman in Saudi Arabia, Nick de Vries in 2023. We've kind of gone off what we know historically, even though there's nothing documented in the game rules to suggest this is what happens to an inactive driver. So I am curious to see how they communicate that to the player base.
You make a great point, Rob. This is the first time in the history of the game it's strategically in your favor to keep an inactive driver on your team, and so I think they have to make an unprecedented move to close the loop on it. And that's actually a great segue into our second hit list item, because this isn't the only inactive driver mess we have to deal with this week. Ollie Bearman's rejoining Haas in place of Kevin Magnussen. He's got that 1 race ban for accumulating 12 penalty points and becomes the first driver in F1 history to earn a suspension from the penalty points since the system was enacted in 2014. So what price do you think Ollie comes back at? And what happens if you have potentially Logan Sargeant and Kevin Magnussen on your team and you have to move a lot of pieces?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think to answer your first question, we saw Ollie come in at I believe it was 14 million as a Ferrari driver in Saudi Arabia, got that $1 million increase when he won the driver of the day, finished 7th, 26 points, as you can see on the screen here. I wouldn't expect him to come in at that price. I fully expect there are probably zombie teams that are running Oliver Bearman as a Ferrari driver from, 10, 15 races ago and may well own him, and Ollie Bearman that comes in as a Haas driver. I have to think that there's going to be 2 Ollie Bearman driver cards in the game, even though you can't see the Ferrari one right now. So I do think Bearman will come in somewhere between 10 and 15 million. I know that's a huge range to assume. I would be very surprised if he came in any price above Kevin Magnussen. I don't think that really makes sense because K-Mag's had an exceptional fantasy season, and Bearman is, a rookie going into a car that's, embedded very much in the midfield. So I'd probably hazard a guess to narrow it down to somewhere between 10 and 12, but I think that's kind of throwing an arrow at the dartboard for me. What about you?
You can see on the screen here, he has some big shoes to fill. Magnussen leads the grid in both value gained and overtakes on the season, so hopefully he doesn't come in at that same price point in the 12 million range as K-Mag, but also I think he has a little bit more upside than his teammate for the weekend, Nico Hülkenberg, so I think 10, 11 million would be appropriate for it. For me, already having to play transfer roulette with the Sargeant situation, I think I have to avoid Bearman, even though he showed so much promise in his debut with Ferrari, just because it's a 100% chance you've now got to move out of Bearman for Singapore next week when Magnussen comes back. It's just too many moving pieces. Considering the top of the grid's unstable, I don't want to have to shuffle everywhere next week.
Let me pose you a question. Or should I say, what price, I know it would only be for 1 week, but what price would tempt you to consider Ollie Bearman in a Haas? Like, how low do we have to go?
So for me, I have to make 2 transfers to get Sargeant out of my team, and it's Sargeant and Sonoda for, I think I said Zhou and Albon. It would have to be enough to make that work. Basically, in 2 transfers, I would have to get Bearman and someone. I already have Colapinto on my team to make it work. So I think lower than the game's probably got an appetite for, but if he showed up at 7-8 million in the Alex Albon range, then I'm in.
It's a conversation. Definitely. I think it's going to be really interesting. But again, as you say, there's just so many moving parts in Baku. So an extremely low priority transfer, I think, this weekend, even if you've got 3 in hand or a wild card in play.
Now, if you have both Magnussen and Sargeant, I'd love to hear in the comments what you're going to do about it, because that's got to be the coolest decision of the week, and we're happy to weigh in on that too. Rob, before we move on, let's cover off the Fan Amp Pick of the Week question, which compares the 2 rookies. Who sets a faster qualifying time, Bearman or Colapinto? I'll let you go first.
We deliberated a little bit about this off air. It's a tricky one because you've got a proven, I wouldn't even call him proven, but Ollie Bearman, we know what he's capable of from what we've seen so far. He's got a seat locked up next year with Haas. And then you've got Colapinto, who drove exceptionally well in Monza. I think you alluded to this last week that Monza is, in terms of all of the circuits on the calendar, a relatively easy one. So I do think he will have his work cut out for him at a street circuit that has undone in the past, even the most experienced drivers on the grid. So I'm going to give the edge, but not by much, to Ollie Bearman. So I'm going to say Bearman faster than Colapinto, but by how much? I'm going to say less than or equal to 1/10. What about you?
I think the exact same answer. And just as an extension on that too, Colapinto had success in Formula 3 at Monza previously, and also in there was a Euro Cup that he participated in 2022 where he had a lot of success at Monza before, but he's never raced at Baku before. This is a very, very different circuit, so I don't think he'll necessarily tear it up in qualifying. And he did, even at Monza, an easier circuit, qualify P18. So I think Bearman will do just enough. I'd go as far as to say to get into Q2 and edge out Colapinto in this debate here. Now, Bearman rejoined the grid coming from Ferrari originally, and I want to talk about them next because they had a really impressive performance at Monza. Does this put them back on the menu for you as the de facto number 2 constructor, Rob?
Yeah, I think Monza really opened the door for a lot more variety recently. We've seen in the last few races Mercedes and McLaren being a very popular pick for many an F1 fantasy strategist. But I think we're very much now at the nexus of the last part of the season, where you're not just looking for assets that are reliable, but almost somewhat of a differential. And there were probably quite a few slow movers to Ferrari last week. I know some people had just the constructor or just one driver. And I think if you were able to make that move early, double up on a Leclerc and a Ferrari, or a Sainz and a Ferrari, or whatever it might be, probably sets you up quite nicely for Baku. I mentioned just before that we're going to another high-speed track on the back of Monza, and then after that, Singapore. Ferrari obviously looked the goods in Italy. I can kind of see that translating into Azerbaijan as well. So I do like them for the foreseeable future based on what we've seen at the moment.
I love the consistency, like you said. 45 or more fantasy points in 13 of the first 16 races. Only McLaren have more qualifying teammate points. Only Red Bull have more fastest pit stop points. So for me, they're definitely back on the menu as my number 2 constructor. Meanwhile, for Charles, I think if you have a bigger budget, he could be an expensive alternative to Oscar Piastri. So you could run him either with Piastri or with Lando Norris. And a lot of teams really thrived on this last week, got a few extra points as a differential. And with Leclerc, he's just one price bump away from tier A. So if you're thinking about bringing him onto your team, this is the last hurrah where you could get that 0.5 million or even 1 million boost like he got at Monza.
Yeah, I mean, you make an excellent point, because even though he probably won't have the same budget upside as an A-tier asset, I think it's very likely he goes up above 25 million in Baku. His production won't change more or less each week. So I think, you could be or have some concern around potentially booking in a transfer if in Singapore he is an A-tier asset and you don't, or you are put off a bit by the lack of budget increase. But at the same time, I don't think his fantasy point scoring potential is going to change all that much. So there's no harm in running, Leclerc for the next couple races, just because, you look at someone like Lando Norris, another A-tier asset, still producing the fantasy goods at the moment. So there's nothing wrong with backing, Leclerc and Norris, for example. And I think at this late stage of the season, budget building is probably less of a priority, unless, of course, you're extremely desperate to build a bit more.
And for those players with autopilot of the 3X DRS boost chip, it's great to have 2 top flight drivers on your team that you can pivot to. One other point on Ferrari I want to mention is that if you have the Sargeant conundrum and you need to move out of him and downgrade an asset, I would not go from Ferrari to Mercedes to make that happen. Take another midfield driver like I am with Yuki Tsunoda and try to find that extra million or two somewhere else, because I think Ferrari are significantly above Mercedes at this point in the season. And so from constructors on the rise to constructors on the decline, Rob, tell us about Red Bull and their recent slide.
Yeah, they've definitely been suffering in comparison to their rivals in the top half of the grid. I think, we've talked about it already. The upgrades, or I'd call it upgrades, their changes to the car have really not gone according to plan at all. They've only had one score above 56 points in their last 6 races, which is a far cry from the 80 and 90 points per race we saw in the first half of the season. I think there is, as I mentioned as well before, a possibility that Red Bull will bring upgrades in Circuit of the Americas to correct whatever it is that they've made to the car that has sent it backwards. Even, it's been well documented, Max has been struggling with the car. I think people are now going to sympathize with Checo, who's obviously had a torrid time this season trying to get the most out of the car. So, at the price they're at 31.4 million, you're just not, Max, I mean to say, and then Red Bull at 29.2, you're just not seeing the level of production that you'd expect from an A-tier asset when, as you can see here on screen, Lando Norris and the McLaren constructor are certainly churning out much more frequent and consistent fantasy production.
And you said it really well at the top of the show. It seems like home races, new engines, historical performance, nothing is enough to run Red Bull at this point. And even though they have back-to-back 1-2 finishes at this circuit, and Checo really seems to turn it around here, I have no faith in Red Bull this weekend. And I think even that bad luck extends down to its sister team in VCarb. We saw Yuki Tsunoda running the only upgrades for that team last weekend. He DNF'd that race, and he called the upgrades, quote, downgrades after that race. And so they're definitely starting this week on the wrong foot as well, and I worry that they may have pulled a Ferrari with their latest upgrade. So it might be a while before Yuki and Daniel are back in our good graces. So I would downgrade Red Bull, I'd downgrade VCarb, and get into some alternatives while you can.
You highlighted before, how strong McLaren have been as well lately. Do you want to talk me through how how likely a double or a triple up is for you in the last third of the season. Just before I give you the mic, I've just been so impressed by their consistency. I know you said before as well that even though it wasn't necessarily a great result for them in Monza, they are still able to get those front row lockouts and those podium finishes. I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I would be very surprised if there's a sudden migration away from at least 2 McLaren assets in the next few races.
I think I agree that McLaren are going to be the team to beat, and they should have a lot of high-end potential on your team. I'm worried that for me to run an entry-level version of this with double Sauber and Colapinto, this is a track that eats cars alive, even when it was earlier in the season these last few years. Last year, there were only 2 DNFs, but then there was a streak of 4 or 5 DNFs, and then back-to-back years of 7 DNFs. So we could see a lot of cars get eaten. I had a really good week last week with Triple McLaren, but I had the one driver to DNF, so I ended up with a middling score. So I'd like to avoid that as much as possible, but I think I just have to pick my spots, try to get lucky in these next few races.
Yeah, definitely. It's a game of luck if the DNFs lately and the disqualifications are anything to go by. So, I think, as we say every week, use the free practice sessions to gauge what we expect from car performance for each team. But when we look back on a fantasy weekend, it is, I think, more or less the DNFs that do set apart the good from the great weekends.
Rob, let's transition into some of these lineups that we recommend for this weekend in 3 lineups for 3 budgets. We've escalated the entry price from 115 to 116. So maybe we start with a team very similar to what we based this section on last time. I like a team that is based with Lando Norris, McLaren, and Ferrari. So you have a lot of high-end potential, potentially as much as 175 to 200 points just in 3 assets, and then sprinkle in decent enough midfield drivers. So I have Hülkenberg, Ocon, Albon, and Bottas all in that 116 million range.
Okay. I like this a lot. I do wonder if you are going for 2 premium drivers, it probably does mean the bottom of the barrel in terms of Sauber and maybe Colapinto. So I think this is, as you pointed out, the best of the best in terms of the midfield drivers. Sorry, did you say Bottas in this slot?
That's
here?
right.
Yeah. So you're probably going for the best drivers or close to that in each of the teams. But if we're looking at someone with a double premium lineup already, I'd have to hazard a guess, maybe George Russell, if we can even squeeze him in, and then probably the very lowest. I'm not even sure if we have enough room for these guys at 116, as you pointed out, but I think that might just be short.
That's definitely one way to get in there. And
Yeah.
Unfortunately, with poor George, he's had just a rough stretch lately. Bad luck, some difficulties with the car. Now Mercedes seem like they're on the back foot. So there are definitely some pros and cons to both. If he can turn it around, you get some big price upgrades. You've got a top heavy team with 2 good drivers, 2 good constructors. Just got to hope you avoid the DNFs at Baku.
Definitely. Do you want to talk me through the next level of team budgets for?
Sure.
Yes.
For 121, this is right around where I am right now. And I like the entry-level triple McLaren. So triple McLaren, Ferrari, double Sauber, Colapinto. So now you have Colapinto, who could potentially have another good week, get you that good price bump, but he's very enabling on the cost cap side. And then that all-powerful triple McLaren and Ferrari build. So then you just have to tap dance around the DNFs.
Yeah, I think Colapinto is going to surprise us again. He probably won't have as good a run at Baku as he did in Monza, but I do feel confident in those Williams upgrades lately. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see another kind of P12 to P14 finish for the Williams driver in Azerbaijan.
That'd be tremendous. I hope so, for the sake of our team.
And then for this last tier, the slightly more premium heavy lineups probably means a little bit more of an upgrade in this driver slot, and maybe again some changes to these back markers.
Yeah, so like we mentioned in the Ferrari for real segment, I think we can do here Norris, Leclerc, Hülkenberg, Albon, Colapinto, McLaren, and Ferrari. So now you have lots of options for autopilot. You can keep this cooking for the 3x boost if you still have it. You get Leclerc in his last Tier B outing. A lot of good upside for points and cost cap and a differentiator, because I can't afford this, Rob. You can't afford this. So if you run it and it hits the way it did last week, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it was somewhat telling last week on those that were able to capitalize on the Logan Sargeant loophole where they were running Colapinto, Sargeant, and Albon. I think Williams are not as bad as they were earlier in the season, and Albon's looked the goods. He had a points finish in Monza. If it wasn't for his disqualification in Zandvoort, I think he would have been on for another really good haul of points. And then Hulkenberg, we know how good he is as a qualifier as well. So I think, as you pointed out, a much more reliable backing of those midfield and back marker drivers.
That's probably the headline that got Motorsport to reach out to F1. Holy smokes, people are running triple Williams. We got to stop this. Now, if Mercedes show up in free practice, they're looking the goods, and you want to move them in, you can just substitute Charles and the Ferrari constructor for Mercedes and Lewis, and that frees you up another million and a half or so. You can spread that around the midfield and upgrade where you see fit. I think I'd need to see a race before I moved that much of my team, especially for all the transfer capital you'd have to move to get there, but something to consider if you have a build that already has some Mercedes in it.
Definitely. I again, Lewis, much like Piastri and Leclerc, approaching that $25 million threshold. So I fully expect the Brit has only got 2, max 3 races until he also is an A-tier asset.
It'll be interesting to see how these drivers end the season and what their season-long price gain looks like. Lewis has been on fire lately.
Definitely.
Rob, as we talk about the Sargeant loophole and the ways that it impacts the whole game, I want to talk about the Fantasy Formula leaderboard because we had another big week from Porsche F1. They're now P1 in the Global League and in the Fantasy Formula League, and he ran a triple McLaren and Ferrari build, this very typical lineup that we've been talking about throughout the show. Meanwhile, Andrew, with Leapers 1, ran triple Ferrari, Hamilton, Mercedes, and Sargeant. So now Andrew's going to have a lot of work to try to get back into a more McLaren build and potentially trying to move out of Sargeant. So this decision on how they close the loophole, if they can completely close the loophole, could impact who wins the whole thing.
I think it absolutely will. I am curious to see how detrimental it can be to those people that maybe did take advantage of that. But again, you know, the whole schmozzle might have been avoided a week ago had there been a bit more proactivity, but that's in the past. I think now we've just got to focus on what's ahead of us. As you said, Porsche F1 got I wouldn't say an insurmountable lead, but a 54-point lead with only a handful or so of races left is something you'd have to be pretty comfortable with.
Absolutely. But the way we've had things lately, you think back to Canada, Monaco, you're just one decision away from an 80 to 100 point swing. So yeah, anything's possible.
Definitely.
We're back at it this Saturday at 7 a.m. Eastern, noon BST for our Baku live show only on the FanAmp YouTube channel. Don't forget to send in your lineups and contest answers to the Fantasy Formula base on the FanAmp app so we can have another exciting show. Rob, any final thoughts for this week?
I think it's going to be another spicy weekend in Azerbaijan, so I'm going to have to strap in and make these decisions count for hopefully what is another good showing where we're just having to dodge the DNF roulette.
You know, as the week goes on, I'm ready to test the limits of how they close this loophole. And is there a way I can keep them on my team and just eke out some extra points? So that's going to be my goal between now and Saturday. That's all for this week's episode. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you on Saturday.